going to be Dr. Deborah Payne, Dr. Karen Terry, and Dr. Barbara Radcliffe. My apologies. Give me just one moment here. So sorry. The 3D learners, differences, diversity, and divergent. Dr. Karen Terry is an assistant professor at Valdosta State University in the Department of Teacher Education. She teaches in the undergraduate, elementary, middle grades, and secondary education programs and teacher leadership graduate program. Her research interests include education, policy, and disruptive innovation. Dr. Barbara Radcliffe is an associate professor in the elementary, middle grades, and secondary education programs, as well as the Reading Endorsement Program at Valdosta State University. Her research interests focus on educator preparation as well as early and adolescent literacy. And last but not least, Dr. Deborah Payne worked as middle school teacher and academic coach before moving into higher education. She currently serves as the department head for teacher education in the College of Ed and Human Services. Her department serves at both the undergraduate and graduate levels through numerous degree opportunities. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce these ladies to you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you all. So it looks like we have a wonderful crowd here today. So let me go ahead and share this screen and we'll jump right into our first session. I think I'll need to do side by side. That's it. Let's see here. You know, I don't know that we'll ever really get used to virtual, will we? Okay, is that good? Are we good? Yes. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you again so much for being here. We're, Dr. Terry and I, along with Dr. Radcliffe, we're going to be really digging into differences, divergence, and diversity. When I think about divergence, I think about the literature book, you know, because that's my background in ELA. And then we're going to really talk about how can these three key areas be addressed when we're thinking about instruction and building and planning through multimodal and multi-dimensional planning. Those are pretty big words here, but we got it. We can do this. So it's not. Uh-oh, I'm not clicking through. There we go. Maybe it just needed a chance. So let's talk a little bit about how we start with these words, these three big words of difference, divergence, and diversity. You're going to hear us talk about it's the big 3D here. They're nouns. You'll notice that they're nouns, and they really talk about things that are dissimilar, or there's a variation, or that there is a really big difference in whether it's the quality, the condition, the state of being, that they're really not alike. So when we really think about difference, we're talking about the quality that you see here that makes one person or thing unlike another. What's different about that person? What's different about that student? When we think about divergence, we're actually talking about an act or instance of moving or drawing apart. Divergent, how they go apart from something that's in place. And then when we think about diversity, that's the quality or state of having many different forms, many different types. And of course, diversity is a really key word that we hear through social media, through all of our media outlets. And so how does these three main big 3D, difference, divergence, and diversity, how can we use those tools in our planning through the M2 to make strong instructional decisions, okay? And when we think about this big M2, we're actually talking about multimodal access, which may be a new word to you. It may be something that you're not familiar with, and we're also be thinking about multi-dimensional design. So the big 3D, addressing it through the M2. Okay, it's kind of almost called Mission Impossible, the M2, you know. So we're going to look at all three of those, and then we're also going to look at what does it mean with multimodal? What does it mean for multidimensional? And how does that look when we're considering students and planning? So a lot of times we think, and as we begin to work through understanding our students, we talk a lot about readiness, interests, and student perspectives. We think a lot about, in Georgia, we think a lot about TEKS. We think a lot about the differentiation standard, which I think is number 5 on TEKS, and for our student candidates, and it's also number 5. And so it's the idea of what does that really mean when we're thinking about who do we have as learners? And obviously, readiness is a big factor. And we know that readiness is not a fixed formula. Students are ready to learn. Their readiness level, it fluctuates, it changes throughout, obviously, the day, their life, their grade band, even within a class, because of the information that's presented. Their readiness can change. It's not a fixed point in time. And so when we think about readiness and knowing our students, that plays into an aspect of planning. And it's important to consider that. Obviously, interest. We know that motivation is completely connected to interest. If a student is interested in the topic, the concept, the work, then their motivation is a little bit higher. And so we all obviously understand that interest should be embedded within that planning, again, to allow choice for students, so that we know that choice is also a really big factor for students, even if it's a this or that, an either or situation. It helps to connect to that interest. And then one that we're asking our candidates here now to really consider at VSU is the student perspectives, because that truly allows our candidates to consider, what is that student bringing into the class that we need to consider? How will their background, how will their uniqueness, how will their experiences as they come to class, as they sit in our lessons, how will that impact our learning by using their senses and various representations, so that they understand that, first of all, what they bring into the classroom is important, it's unique. And then if we present multiple perspectives, then we're also building a better student. That it's not a one side, it's not a one perspective, because that way, then obviously then we're tapping into the idea of appreciation and the idea of acceptance, and really talking to some about the social emotional aspect of getting along with everybody. So those 3 key of knowledge of students plays in, obviously, to our differences, which is part of that 3D model. And so when we talk about the so what of differentiation, which leads to that knowledge of students, we have to intentionally make those choices. We have to intentionally, and we think about differentiation, it kind of leads us to that product, process, and content, and or environment. Those are the big key words that we think about differentiation. And that's important, because again, that goes back to the knowledge of students. Okay. And so the big idea of knowing students is that it allows us to tap into interest, and again, which taps into motivation, which will tap into learning. And what we know, again, is that by providing choice and respectful task, this is the big so what of knowing students. And all this is back. We know this. We know through a myriad of research that the idea of understanding students and differentiating, whether it's by product, process, content, and or environment, makes a huge difference in the learning that can occur in a classroom. So, Dr. Terry, tell us about readiness a little bit.
Thanks, Dr. Payne. Yeah, and so when we look at readiness, one of the most important things that we talk about is that readiness is not a fixed factor. Dr. Payne kind of talked about that a moment ago. But when we look at readiness, previously, so much emphasis in the research and what we were doing in our lesson design had to do with cognition and content. But what we're finding out, though, that's really important is that readiness encompasses so much more than just what a student brings in terms of cognition and knowledge of a particular of their content. So what we want to do is kind of bring the lens back and incorporate. It's a daunting task, but also look at things like affective behaviors. What developmental stage is the student in physically, or their ability for general communication, thinking, reasoning, other skills other than just academic content. So in doing that, like, you know, it can seem like a lot, but we're going to talk about how can we address the holistically what the student is bringing when they come into our classrooms. So we, you know, just a little bit more about interest. Again, bringing the lens back. Previously, when we looked at interest, we were sort of looking at, you know, hobbies or what students like or what was developmentally appropriate, what was going on with social media or going on in their lives. Again, even with interest now, getting to know students personally means so much more than that. Again, pulling the lens back to look at you know, why their interests are what they are and what are their strengths and what do they feel comfortable with. And we're going to talk a little bit about comfort zones and how interest plays into that. So this is pretty familiar. We want to kind of go back and look at a baseline. Well, the camera's changed. But we want to go back and look at Vygotsky. So this is pretty common for all of us here. But just to review a little bit, because we're going to kind of, again, bring the lens back. There we go.
That was weird.
So let's just review what Vygotsky's theory is, right? So Vygotsky talked about a zone of proximal development, essentially a comfort zone, right? Of where students were or where they are. But again, the focus of Vygotsky's work was on academic and cognition, right? And that's what we were, when we teach Vygotsky's theory, we're focusing on academics, right? But let's think about Vygotsky's theory, again, pulling the lens back and thinking about it in a broader perspective, in a broader view. So could we apply this theory other than in a cognitive readiness way for content learning? Can the theory be applied to other avenues such as social emotional needs or affective functioning? Can the zone of proximal development be stretched by using multimodalities and multidimensional ideas and strategies when we're doing lesson planning? So let's look at it a different way. So in the research that I needed came out about around 2016, suggested that we could also use Vygotsky's zone of proximal development to talk about comfort zones in other areas. So we use this graphic to kind of show in a different way, in another modality, in a graphic of what ZDP, the zone of proximal development looks like, right? So we know that there are things that students feel very comfortable with, not only academically, but you know, students may struggle with their communication skills or be fearful of sharing in class, or you know, maybe sensory issues of what's going on in the classroom. But things they feel comfortable doing, things they need some support with, and then, as we know, things that they can't do yet, no matter how much support they get, but that's where the growth mindset comes in. So again, pulling back the lens of Vygotsky's theory, we could also talk about comfort zones of our students when they come in our classroom, right? And helping them to step outside of their comfort zone in a particular area. Well, you can't really do that if we don't have the knowledge of our students and what sort of makes them tick, or what could be considered as a blocking agent to their ability to feel comfortable and secure in their learning environment in order to grow. So in order to know what their fear zone is, that's, again, going back to the knowledge of our students, not just where they are academically, but holistically, what do they bring into the classroom, like Dr. Payne talked about. And the only way for us to do that is really to get them to know them in a holistic way, not simply data points on you know, where they are academically, because we know these other factors can affect that.
And when we're thinking about that in the graphic with that fear zone, what the other thing that we know is that really is tied to your classroom environment. Does that student feel as if they can step out of the comfort, that the environment that's been set up is an environment of safety so that they can move through the fear zone and get to that learning and growth zone? Very key and important. And of course, and now with what students deal with social media, that's a huge factor in trying to step through and to move into that learning zone, is to get through that fear zone.
And one of the things we're really learning our cameras.
I know.
It's like being on the View. We need like camera 3. And one of the things we're seeing as we're out in the field and we're talking to our stakeholders, our mentor teachers, is that they're seeing very different students post-COVID, and they're struggling with issues they've never seen before, and things that in their population that has been the same for almost a decade is now the pendulum has swung so very quickly in the matter of a year or 2 years. And so this is another reason why we're really invested in this research, is that lesson planning has evolved to address some of those things. It has to. That just addressing content alone isn't enough. So when we look at professional development and we look at, we've all been to professional development that talks about differentiated instruction. Like many teacher ed programs, we have a whole course designed just for differentiated instruction. And so we're pretty familiar with this concept. But again, sometimes differentiation is taught in isolation, right? And something that is sort of separate from lesson planning, or can be, but we incorporate that here. So probably a very familiar slide here. But again, we see in the content area, looking at students' interest and their academic readiness, but also what Dr. Payne talked about, differentiating instruction based on their comfort zone in non-academic areas as well. So pretty common here that we look at when we look at differentiated instruction to address differences in our learners.
So that's our first D, is differences through differentiated instruction. And so this takes us to our second D of diversity through culturally responsive teaching.
Yep. And so again, many of us have been to multiple professional development and done our research and our readings to look at culturally responsive teaching and why it's so important, right? And it's a critical piece that, again, we incorporate in our lesson design, and the research tells us why it's so important to address the different cultures, and exactly what Dr. Payne talked about earlier. What do each of our students bring in their uniqueness? Again, a lot to consider, right? Between differentiating for learning differences and holistically the differences of our students, but also the diversity piece and how our students and what they bring to the table culturally. So again, we know, and sometimes that's taught in isolation and not really tied back into exactly what does that look like when I plan a lesson. So let's look at the third D. So neurodivergent, a little kind of new on the scene a little bit. You can share with us in the chat if this is something that you're becoming more familiar with, or the concept of neurodivergence. Let's look at the definition that Perler makes about neurodiversity. It refers to how different brains learn differently. It describes a highly diverse way in which students learn, think, and process information. So neurodivergence, when we talk about a student being neurodivergent, we're really just talking about, their brain, which is unlike any other brains, what Dr. Payne talked about. It makes them unique, right? And how they process essentially the world around them. And it can include, students that are diagnosed as being on the spectrum, attention deficit issues, and essentially learning differences like, the research now around dyslexia and how that's impacting instruction, especially in K2 right now, with the information we have on the science of reading, and just the way students process social emotional issues and mood disorders. The most important thing about neurodivergence is that both in the medical field, as well as those of us in education, neurodiversity it's not a problem to be fixed, but rather that every child is unique, every brain is unique, and how they process information. And so what we know from the research is that neurodivergency is going to require us as educators to think about the different ways that we approach students in our classroom. Again, holistically, not only in their academic learning, but also in affective behaviors as well. So that's our third D, looking at divergent thinking.
Any questions about the first 3Ds? Differences, divergence, and
diversity.
Any questions in the chat, Dr. Radcliffe?
Not yet.
Okay, excellent.
Okay. All right.
So that when we think about this big idea of neurodivergence, and it is a rather new term for me. I definitely did some growing here and had a little growth moment when we started thinking about what does this mean. It can be overwhelming. It can seem like for a classroom, if you've got 18 third graders, and 18 different brains, what am I going to do with all that? How can I address that and really respect, take into account, work toward ensuring that all of my students are growing? And so that really is how we come to this idea of multimodal. And where it is exactly where we need to head as far as thinking about all of these different learners in our classroom. And we're going to shake up a little bit some thinking when it comes to what am I doing for my students? How should I address and consider these individual students? For a long time, we talked about learning styles, and we really, Gardner's learning styles, and how should we address, individual learners through their own style. So we are going to challenge here this idea of this learning style concept versus what does it really mean to have a multimodal lesson that will support all of these different learners in the classroom.
Yeah, so we've been addressing, I think, and we'd love to hear from you if you can type in the chat if we've come from a long way from identifying a particular student's learning style, right? And we've done all kinds of surveys on it. So then we really started to dig into the research, right? Because as we started to look at lesson plan design, students, and we were seeing out in the field as well, how do we really address all of these different learning styles, and how am I really differentiating for the learning style? So when we look at the research, there's two studies here that we want to kind of share with you this morning. And one was actually the top one was actually presented by the Department of Education at the federal level. And essentially it's saying that there's no empirical justification for tailoring instruction to a supposed single learning style of a student. And that we should instead be focusing on developing the most effective and coherent ways to present the content. So this is really a pendulum swing from looking at our students coming in versus the knowledge of the students coming in, but the content that we want to teach, and the skills that we want them to be able to master and to develop. And so what the first study that we're sharing this morning talks about, we should look at different forms of instruction in mutually reinforcing ways that overlap or sweet spot in how content is presented. And we're going to kind of dig into that a little bit more. The second study that was done, again, added to the research. The first one was done in 2012, the second one done in 2018. So we're still seeing that progression in the research, pointing in the direction that really looking at a preferred single learning style can be a hit or miss process. It could depend on the content that's being taught, right? A student could perhaps have something may work more effectively in particular content. Their readiness may also affect how content is absorbed and accepted by a student when we talk about that neurodivergency. So again, this study reinforced the fact that teachers should abandon the use of single learning styles or pigeonholing students in the way that they receive information and process information, and that we should really focus on evidence-based best practice and strategies, again, taking the learner into account, but also the content as well.
Ooh. Is that where are we? What happened to our screen? Oh, it's not good.
There we go. There we go. All right. So, so really what we're looking at when we look at multimodality, anyone familiar, again, feel free to share in the chat if you share these experiences or have worked with some of these concepts. But one of the most popular ones was VARC, right? The VARC learning style protocols. But what we found is that a multimodal approach is so much more effective rather than just trying to target a single one particular learning style. So what this visual shows is that we're not really throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that the VARC learning styles do have validity when they're used in a multimodal fashion.
Right, and you'll see that when you think about learning style, you really are thinking about that individual learner. But when you're lesson planning for your class, it really helps when you think, okay, what can I do with the visual, the auditory, the read, write, and the kinesthetic? How can I layer all this together with the content that will support all the learners? And so that's the paradigm shift, is the idea of the content being multimodal so that it really, in fact, reaches all of the different learners in the class.
Yeah, so what's the difference between, this is something, we talk about to try to sort of make something abstract a little more concrete, but what's the difference between a learning style and multimodal learning? Well, we want to think about universal design for learning. So much of our work now is done with the implementation of technology, and that's a consideration that we certainly want to take into account. So instead of investing in what I talked about earlier, learning style inventories and trying to figure out, because we know it can change based on readiness, based on content, based on the level of rigor, perhaps, and other things that are in the classroom environment. So instead of categorizing students according to so-called results or what they think their primary learning style is, we should really look to facilitate multimodal learning. So planning to engage students, exactly what Dr. Payne just talked about, engaging students with a combination, a myriad of addressing visual, auditory, kinesthetic ways of interacting with the content. And again, going back to knowing our students, and where they are. So let's kind of dive in a little bit more into UDL. Anyone familiar with Universal Design for Learning? Feel free to type that in the chat. So how does UDL play a role in multimodal lesson design? So UDL really came out of the special education world, much like RTI and MTSS. But really what it does is, and we love this graphic, and we use it with our candidates as well, is again, just what Dr. Payne talked about, It can be information overload in all of the different aspects that students bring into the classroom. How do we address all of that? How do we make sure we're reaching all of our students? So I'll give you a minute to kind of absorb the graphic, but this is certainly we're modeling multimodal by using this graphic to help explain what UDL is. All right.
Do we have a video on it?
I think we have them. We're going to share a video.
Well, let's see if we can get this video to play. Is it embedded?
There we go.
While you're doing that, Kelly Davison shared that she just started reading Equity by Design by Chardin and Middleton.
We'll come back to that.
Hey, Dr. Payne, I don't think that we can hear it. You might have to close your screen and get back in, because you'll want to check the box that says that you can share your speaker when you're sharing.
Close. Okay, hang on a second. I don't have that ability to say. I think maybe you have to do that, Natalie. I think as since the owner, you've got to.
Maybe try again.
Okay. Can you hear now? Would you try?
No.
Yes, you can hear. No, you cannot.
Okay.
No, I cannot.
We can.
And I cannot request control to play it.
Okay, so maybe if I don't do side by side, since it's closed caption. Let me try that. I don't see that. Do you see how you can?
I'm not sure why it's not picking up from our own mic. If we can't get it, we can always just type the link in, and they can watch it later.
Yeah, I don't have anything in here that says I've got turn on captions. Do you see where I can do that? We've only been doing this for 2 years. They think we'd have it by now, don't you? I don't have that ability to do that. Would you like to read the captions of the video?
Or we can we'll maybe put the chat in, put it in the chat, and they can watch it later.
Which would be better? Watch later or read captions?
Let's watch it later.
Okay.
But maybe try one more time on your PowerPoint. Oh. No. Oh, maybe. Well, yeah, let's just play it through.
Go straight to YouTube. Mhm.
This person's chair.
Dr. Radcliffe, what do we have in our chat?
Kelly Davidson shared that she had just started reading Equity by Design by Chardin and Novak on UDL in Equity and Learning.
Excellent.
Would she be
Excellent.
willing to share?
Are you willing to share anything about what you're seeing, Kelly?
Well, I just started reading it yesterday, so I don't have a lot that I can talk about quite yet. But I do like how it's got a lot of concrete strategies. They do talk about it. They're working within the framework of culturally responsive as well as culturally sustainable learning. So I like that as well. And they are looking at it also from a social justice and learning imperative. So I would highly recommend it. So far, I like how they have implementation spotlights, words of teacher candidates. I think that that's really great for us. So
Excellent. Yeah. And would you put the name of that book in the chat just so
Yes.
others can? Oh, okay. So, yeah, thank you. So again, this whole idea of this multimodality, multimodal learning, and how will it look as we present lessons into in the classroom for our students? And why is it so great? Really, is that it provides an opportunity to construct for our students to construct knowledge, and that's obviously one of our primary goals. And they do that through engagement. And that and so the more that students engage, the more likely they are to make those connections and to tap into that prior learning and that background knowledge, because they're starting to make those connections between their own lives and their new learning and what's going on in the classroom. And then, of course, we know that it's never been a one size fits all, that we do have diverse learners. And then when we think about how we present the content in a multimodal presentation, that we're going to hit those diverse learners. We're going to support those diverse learners, regardless of what they bring into the classroom with their backgrounds or experiences.
Okay. So,
Yep. All right. Another question.
all right, so Roberta's asking, she said she's read an article on UDL, and she's asking if it's similar to, or if it's drawing in that learners learn better using auditory, visual, and kinesthetic strategies instead of just one or the other.
Yes, yes, and that's, oh my gosh, that's almost a setup to this slide.
Thanks, Roberta.
So we promised that that was not a plant, but that's exactly right. So so when we look at student perspectives and what Dr. Payne talked about earlier, is that you're exactly right, that learning styles, single learning styles should not drive lesson design. And that's certainly something that we incorporate here for our candidates, but rather the focus on evidence-based strategies that drive multimodality. And that's exactly, we'd like to say that we planned not having auditory on our video for that reason, that you could see how taking the audio out versus having the audio in, adding that extra modality, how that changed your experience in viewing the video. And so, yeah, so maybe that was a plan as well, but that you're exactly right, that when you design instruction using various learning modes, that you create a synergy in the learning outcome. And that's why we have the graphic there too, of the way that the brain processes information. And that essentially, you're exactly right, that UDL talks about a convergence of the way in which content is shared with the learner. So, this is something that we talk to our candidates about to understand the concept of synergy. And surprisingly, it's somewhat of a new concept for them, but something that we really want to drive home in our lesson design and what we're seeing, especially in learners that are coming. Our classrooms look very different post-COVID. And so we kind of talk about that, exactly what you're alluding to, is that by providing multimodal processes, that it creates a synergy in the learning. All right, so we're going to move into our second D because I want to be conscious of the time. The second D that we focus on in the research in lesson design and implementing in lesson design is multidimensional design. So this graphic, if you look at the top of the graphic, we're looking at the individual learner, right? And we know that they're coming, as Dr. Payne talked about, they're coming into the classroom with varying degrees of readiness, right? Cognitive, social, emotional, affective behaviors. So when we look at the top of multi-dimensional design, we look at the top, we're again focusing on the individual, their academic skills, what they bring to the table, and then what we're teaching, right? Grade level standards. Now look at the bottom. Now we're looking at a collective as a whole and what the classroom culture looks like, social practices, again, participation, their sense of belonging versus their own self-identity. That's a lot to think about. But it is something that we approach when we design lessons. So what is multidimensional lesson planning? We're probably doing it and we don't even realize it, but it's something that, we're very intentional about when we look at lesson design. So 3 areas for multidimensional lesson planning: the cognitive engagement, that we've always focused on, right? We look at the standards, we look at knowledge, comprehension, how we evaluate, how we measure learning targets, right? But there's 2 more that we have to consider even when we're planning our lessons. The second one is motivation or behavioral engagement. That's where we're kind of talking about their level of interest, that real world relevance. How do we approach getting to that intrinsic motivation, that sweet spot where students feel comfortable in their learning environment? And last but not least, I mean, gosh, post-COVID, the social, emotional, and mental health of our students in our classroom, and even for us as practitioners, that self-assertion or belongingness, that sense of security that's been diminished, that has to be addressed. And we address that in lesson design. All right, so let's look at the first one, cognitive engagement. Again, this is where we've always focused lesson planning. Probably where we feel the most comfortable, and where, if we're not too careful, we can get too much of a laser focus on leaving a lesson just at this level. So the levels on the left, I'm sure you recognize those. Anybody want to type that in the chat? And that's something very basic that we, of course, focus on when we send our candidates out into the field in their lesson design. But there's Bloom's, and we look at web as well. So let's go to the 2 that we maybe don't think about as much intentionally when we lesson design. Motivational engagement. So again, the levels, we want to make sure we're grabbing the attention of our students, that it's relevant, the intrinsic motivation. And then we also kind of talk about the activities that and the strategies that we can employ when we're lesson designing to address motivational engagement. And then, of course, social emotional. Again, sometimes the social emotional piece, differentiated instruction, culturally responsive teaching, they can be taught in isolation. And what we're trying to say is that, again, to be intentional in your lesson design. So when we're talking about class discussions or creating a safe space in classrooms, how do we do that when we think about also teaching the content? And so these are the areas that we look at so that our classrooms have a sense of security and safeness, a sense of belongingness, and that can be incorporated when you use these strategies and activities to align to the content as well. So, my colleagues over here tease me a lot because I love this graphic, and one that I use in lesson design, in the lesson design course. But it's just another way, again, multimodal, to depict when we look at multidimensional lesson planning. We're not looking only at cognitive. Yes, the standards and the learning targets are important, but also in our lesson design, are we addressing the social emotional needs of our students, knowing where they're coming from, sort of where their comfort zones are, and then behaviorally, are we creating a safe space, and how we're interacting with one another?
So the idea that our M2 multimodal and our multidimensional planning can help us address our 3Ds. So if when we've got our diverse learners, our divergent and different learners, then we think about multimodal access, multidimensional planning that hits our targets, will work together and create that learning opportunity for all students in the classroom. And I think our time is, I think we're about a minute over after our intro. And so please feel free. I'm told that you can only see the PowerPoint and not us now. So I'm not really sure what happened there. Okay. Please feel free to pop any questions, comments, concerns, any, thoughts in the chat. And we will be glad to talk about it for a couple of minutes as we get ready to move into our next session. And I did just stop sharing, so. Yes, we definitely were talking about balloons. Thank you very much. So, yeah. The whole, our big idea today was really to start you all thinking about maybe some new concepts of multimodal learning and planning, multidimensional planning to make sure that we hit all of those big areas, the behavioral, social, emotional, and the content as we're thinking about, and to just re-envision what does it look like in our classrooms? What are the lessons that we're presenting? How are we addressing all of our different learners? So we have one that says we use learning focused schools. I can see those strategies would address a lot of those. Absolutely. Learning focus they were very smart in how they marketed because they took the best of many areas and packaged it together to really present that idea of that multi-dimensional and multimodal learning. And that's excellent. Any other questions? We hope that we've sparked a little interest and maybe an idea that you might want to go research and start digging into, maybe some new words that you haven't used in planning up until now, but we are available to support and help. And again, thankful that you took your Tuesday morning to share and to be here with us at PACE. We do have 2 additional sessions coming up. I believe that the links are different links, so you'll need to exit this one, leave this one, and then enter into that next link. Dr. Coleman, any other words about moving forward with PACE?
Yes, so I will post in the chat in just one moment the link to the next session. And just remember that you'll be put in the lobby and we will bring you in right at the top of the hour. And then also I have the 3 winners to announce.
Oh, yeah, the best part of the day, the 3 winners.
So the winners are Jenna Cooper, Jay Mobley, and Suzanne. And so, Suzanne, if you could maybe email me your information. I'm just not familiar which Suzanne that is. So if you could maybe just let me know and we will be sending that out. And then the next session, we'll have another 3 winners. So
congratulations. Good
yes.
job, winners.
So let me just work on adding this link here in just one moment, and then we'll move over to the other session.
Awesome job. Thank you all again. We appreciate you being here. Thanks, Natalie, for getting it set up. And congratulations, winners. We'll see you all in the next session.
Thank you.